Good evening. Welcome to Friday Nights Live from the Parrish. My name is Corinne Erni. I'm the Senior Curator of Arts Reach and Special Projects at the Parrish. While the museum is still closed, I'm very pleased that we can still come together over these online programs every Friday night. And I would like to thank our sponsors who make that possible. Our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, as well as Sandy and Stephen Pearlbinder. Tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to be talking to author and cultural strategist and friend, András Szántó. Andras, welcome to the Parrish.
Nice to see you here and nice to not see everybody, but I'm glad to be here.
Andras, you just accomplished a Herculean task. You wrote a book, here it is, called The Future of the Museum. And you went out and talked to 28 museum leaders from all over the world. And you did this during a time of extreme crisis, a health crisis, we have a pandemic, but also a social and political crisis, a lot of upheaval all over the world, especially since the murder of George Floyd. What prompted you to write a book like that? Also, in a time when museums are going through major crisis because of the pandemic, many museums had to close, staff got laid off, and revenue sources dried up. So what prompted you to write the book in this time, and why now?
Well, the simple answer is that it's provided an opportunity to do this project, something I've been meaning to do for a long time, because like it or not, I had a tremendous amount of time on my hands. My occupation is I'm a strategy consultant to museums and cultural organizations. And so like so many people, I'm running around the world, going to art fairs and all kinds of events. I had a lot of time, but more importantly, the museum directors in the book um, had a lot of time on their hands. So there was sort of an opportunity waiting to be seized, because certainly had the feeling that this may be a technically feasible undertaking. But actually, I'd been closely following the changes in the field for a long time, sort of as a participant, but also as an observer. And I was very aware that there was a really interesting story sort of brewing here. And I had this long-term plan that I would try to get museum directors and conversations with museum directors into a book. Over the years, I've done dozens, maybe more, of various public conversations with museum directors. And I thought it would be great to do this. The other issue that was really making it difficult for me is, well, where do you start? Like, there are thousands of museums around the world. There are obviously some very eminent figures in the field, very eminent museums that somehow would be front of the line.
And you have some of those in your book, but I was curious about your choice of.
Yes, well, I have those, but actually, I don't have as many as one might expect. Um, and the reason for that is because my publisher, Haji Kantz, had published a previous book in the same series, where where the author went out and talked to some of the very eminent figures of the field who really were responsible for this tremendous expansion of museums in the middle of the last century and the second half of the last century. So now that we had this pandemic moment, it sort of created an editorial framework, which allowed me to say, on the one hand, let's focus on the future. There was clearly this sense that a new phase of a new chapter in history was beginning. But also it kind of gave me permission to say, let's try and bring together a group of directors who are going to be working on this for the next several decades potentially. There are two of them in this book are as young as 33 years old. They'll be around for some time, and also that I would then select the museums to reflect the diversity of that future, because probably the most salient thing about the future of museums, if you think about it, is that they are so global now, and they will be increasingly global. So I guess my selection criteria in this context became different than it might have been previously. And it's one of the reasons why half the directors in the book are women. That's not a coincidence. That doesn't actually accurately reflect the realities of our field at the moment. I would say I sort of oversampled, but it is in fact a very important emerging, and I think a very welcome emerging reality. I might add, your museum has already been in the vanguard in this respect, and once again has made a similar decision. Um, but what I'm particularly happy about is that even though it has meant maybe including less like major European institutions as I might have liked, on the other hand, among these 28, you see 4 institutions in Africa, you see a number of institutions in Asia, Latin America. Um, so I think that being able to reflect this global range was very important. But again, the focus would always be in these conversations, what is the future going to bring? And I would have to say, um, look, I think everybody in those months, we're talking May, June, July, everybody had this sort of thirst to talk, to make sense of this new reality. By the way, when we decided to do the book, George Floyd was still out ahead in the distance. We made the decision to do the book after an article I wrote over Easter became widely read. So it was only in around April that we decided to do the book. And then when I began the interviews on the very same week, George Floyd was brutally murdered. So suddenly there was this whole other dimension, this reckoning over racial justice, and everybody was trying to get their heads around not just what's happening in the pandemic and how we're going to reopen, but really what are the deeper, lasting, profound implications on the future of the museum. So we had a lot to talk about.
Right, and I think some of these issues that really came to the fore with all these crises, I think were already brewing in many museums, as you mentioned. What I found really interesting is that you did interview museum leaders from all over the world, from very different kind of museums, old institutions, new institutions. But there seemed to be some threads in these conversations, like some common problems, but also some common outlooks. I think one of the things that struck me that even though, you talk about globalization, globalism, we're all connected, you can see the same show in London, New York, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires. But at the same time, what kind of transpired from some of the conversations you had was that locality is very important as well, and that some of the globalization has had a negative impact on some of these museums or the artist community in these museums. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on that, because
Yeah,
I thought that was an interesting point and something that we also realized, I think, at the Parrish.
yeah. Look, I think there's a two, maybe when I'm very pleased to say the book is starting to be used in classroom settings and universities already. And I think it will have a number of main messages. And one of them is that there is a fairly unified, evolving outlook on the museum, which points the way forward to museums as being more open, more democratic, more inclusive, more porous, more um, socially engaged entities that see their functions as going beyond the so-called traditional functions of collecting, exhibiting, studying, etc. Um, uh, the key message there, I think, and particularly this was true in the pandemic, is there's been a turn towards the community, towards the people who surround the museum. And that is a very welcome development. In the pandemic, it forced many museums to sort of look at their own backyards. But I think in general, this has been going on. And along with that realization, the idea that you are, as an institution, not just there to be sort of the local exemplar of this sort of beautiful, shiny global museum, but you're really there to be embedded with that local cultural and demographic context. That brings another, I think, very important conclusion to the fore, which is that museums, if they really are going to be connected to their localities, that means they're also going to be somewhat different. Because if you're really going to be a faithful mirror, or a really something that is connected to the particular circumstances where you are in Africa, in Asia, in India, in China, you're going to end up being a different kind of institution. And so, as I wrote in the introduction, I think we may be beginning to see a very welcome emergence of a new pluralism of museums. Just as in the late 20th century, we began to see a pluralism of artistic discourses and a much more polyphonic, multipolar art conversation with lots of international positions. We are now beginning to see museums that are different. And a very good example of that is this extraordinary museum leader in Benin, Marie-Cécile Zinsou, who at age 21, I think, grounded her first museum. This was a kind of exhibition space in her country of Benin in West Africa. And soon after she did that, people were telling her, we really should have a real museum, like with all the standards of that are required in order to be able to show works from international museum, climatization, air conditioning, humidification. And so she built her second museum. She wasn't even 30. She built her second museum, which is in Ouidah. And indeed, the president of France came to open an exhibition of these French masterpieces in these beautifully climatized rooms. There was only one problem. It cost a fortune to pay for the electricity to air condition and climatize this space in a very impoverished African country. And this led her to the conclusion that now that she's done this, maybe her next museum doesn't have to be like that at all. And indeed, she's now on her third museum, which will probably be an open air museum, which will be a very African place. Will it be able to show drawings by Dürer? No. But will it be able to do things that are organic to its local context? Yes.
I really enjoyed reading her contribution, as she talks about the audience is very young in Africa. And so you need to get them through the door somehow. And she does that with music, right? So she has local singers sing about the museum. So, that youth really feel like, wow, that's the coolest place in town that you really need to go to. And that is something that several of the people you talk to are talking about as well, like Marc-Olivier Waller, who is a friend also, and says, why would someone come into a museum to see things that they don't understand? And I think that is a very poignant remark, because that is the problem of a lot of museums is a lot of people feel that barrier. And so it's about tearing down those barriers, right?
Yes, that's a term that you hear very often. Alfred Taubman, who owned Sotheby's for a long time, things didn't end well for him, but he started out life in the shoe business. And in his memoirs, he talks about what he called threshold resistance. And he learned this when he was selling shoes, that the difficult part of the whole business is getting people to cross the threshold, to come into the shop. And later on, when he was at Sotheby's, he would say, you need to lower the threshold resistance so that people would come in. I think the threshold resistance is very high, continues to be very high in museums. And indeed, it is often in places like Africa where the museum leaders actually have to explain what even a museum is and really work hard to get those audiences to even come in the doors, that you see some of the most innovative ideas about mediation. And frankly, I think we all have a lot to learn from some of these extraordinary leaders in these emerging places. They're a little bit less encumbered by the baggage that many European and North American institutions have. They're more enterprising. They would say perhaps more desperate. And they think out of the box. I mean, another very good example is next door to Benin in Togo. There's an incredible new museum, which actually has a lot in common with the Parrish, because it's set inside a botanic garden. In fact, it's the only public park in the capital city of Togo. And that is a place where when people come and see the exhibitions, they invite these traditional storytellers and narrators who often sing and dance and speak in verse in front of these works in local dialects to mediate and explain what these works are. So um, I think that in general, if you read through the book, what you find is a generation of museum directors who are working to lower that threshold resistance. Now, obviously, digital technology helps a lot, but so does great food. So does, frankly, wall labels you can read. As so does friendly frontline staff and non-intimidating architecture. So there's really a rethink going on in the many areas of the museum.
Right, and I think people need to see themselves somehow reflected in, inside the museum. And I just wanted to give a brief example of an exhibition we did at the Parrish a couple of years ago with Barthélemy Togo, who, is an internationally renowned artist. He is from Cameroon, where he also has a farm. And so during his exhibition, he was serving coffee in the gallery. Of course, that's every registrar's nightmare. But, it just created such an incredible atmosphere. So you have like world-class art hanging on the wall, but you also have something, a ceremony, a ritual that brings people together, that people can connect to. And so people could sit at the table with Barthélemy and have a cup of coffee and the conversation. And another thing I want to mention, which I think is important, which I can also speak from my own experience, is to tear down the barriers within the museum, the silos between certain departments, for example, education and curatorial, which is always very, very, very separate. And again, with Barthélemy, we worked on a project with school children where we asked them about their sense of belonging to society. Because, for example, out on the East End, in some schools, over 50% of the school children are of Latin American heritage. So, this was a very important revelation, and also a way to bring in these students and their families to come and see the work of Barthélemy, because he made them write postcards to him and he framed those postcards and they became part of the exhibition. So I think this is just an example of how you can really involve your audiences to come into the museum.
Right. I mean, I think that's what you're illustrating is two things, both of which I think are having a profound impact on the thinking of museums today. One is this repositioning of the museum as a home, as a welcoming place, and which you're beginning to see in so many ways in museums today. Just the comfort level, that you can sit down, that you're allowed to sit down, that you can feel good, that you can have a great meal. I mean, architecture really is beginning to absorb these ideas. So, and when I asked the museum directors, what is the museum for you? These kinds of words kept coming back. One of the directors, Anton Belov, another institution that has similarities to the Parrish in a kind of green space with modest-sized buildings in Moscow, he said the museum should be like your friend, a place that sort of takes your hand and helps you along, which is very different from the relationship the museum used to have with its audience. So that's one major artery of change. But the other one is a kind of social agenda, which is that you're seeing a generation of museums take on a new role where they are beginning to step into spaces that used to be served by other kinds of organizations. First and foremost, educational organizations, schools. They are stepping into the vacuum left behind, absence of after-school program. I mean, for a long time in this country, sadly, they've been filling the vacuum left behind by the absence of art education.
Libraries,
Libraries. But now you're also seeing kind of social justice initiatives, right? So you're seeing, well, obviously in the pandemic, we saw museums being turned into COVID centers. We saw museums operating food kitchens, soup kitchens. sending out meals to the hospitals so that the doctors would have something to eat. And we're seeing kind of this sort of democratic, or what's the right word, socially activist strain in museums. A good example of it being the Brooklyn Museum, which I happen to look out to when I'm not in Long Island, where they have these wonderful, for example, one program that's mentioned in the book, where they work with youth who have been booked on minor infractions, jaywalking, what have you, dime bag, and who can essentially clear their records by working with the museum on a program that allows them to clear their records and not then have to be marked by this infraction long term.
I think that's brilliant. And I think Franklin Sirmans is doing something similar at the Perez, where he has the art detective program, where he brings cops and kids into the museum to look and talk about art.
And understand why that work looks so differently from a kid from the neighborhood and from a cop from the neighborhood. They see the same object, but two very different messages. And I think what's important to note is that this impulse to add these dimensions to the museum, they are not instead of the scholarship and the seriousness and the devotion to the artworks and the support of the artists. It's not a zero-sum game in the eyes of this generation of museum leaders. It is an additive. It's a kind of, as I say, it's like a ring of Saturn that can be added. A little bit easier to do for a contemporary art institution than, let's say, for a big encyclopedic museum where so much of the effort goes into the scholarship and the conservation and the maintenance of these vast collections. But you're seeing it really across the board. And I think, you're also talking about a generational attitude. People who are, came of age in the 70s and 80s, who were reading Foucault and Derrida and Adorno, for whom the idea of the museum was defined more by the Beaubourg in Paris than by the Louvre in Paris, for example. People who came of age with computers and globalization and the internationalization of the art world. So there is a new mindset among many directors, even directors who are in charge of very large institutions, who have a very progressive point of view on the possibilities of the museum.
Right. And here I would like to actually read one of the comments from Leslie Wayne, an artist. Thank you, Leslie. And she says, how do you develop that local museum culture without becoming regional in the pejorative sense? So how do you maintain that quality? It's, I think, what you just talked about. And I think, like you say, and like many of these museum leaders talk about, is that you need to have a balance. One doesn't replace the other.
I think that what's very important is not to see this as a dichotomy at all, because it's not an either or. And so I think there's a tendency to see a kind of town and gown issue, that somehow the local is going to be somehow not sophisticated, and there's going to be a tension between those two. First of all, it simply isn't borne out in reality. I think that look at Long Island, that you have a situation where it's just not the case. You're not in some sort of remote, disengaged reality. You have very, very sophisticated art groups who are tapped into the zeitgeist, who are right around you. We actually collaborated a little bit when you bought Auto Body, this wonderful artist collective based in Bellport, where I spend a lot of time. These young kids who put up these road signs. That's not supporting that local art collective is in no way having to make a choice between one and the other.
No, and obviously that's where also the curator comes in. You go, I think curiosity is key. You have to go out, you have to visit a lot of artists, and then you have to understand where the talent is. And I mean, I'm happy to say we have a really thriving artist community out on the East End. There's of course an incredible legacy, but we do a triennial, which is called Artists Choose Artists, in which we invite well-known artists as jurors to select emerging artists from an open call. And we usually have over 300 submissions, and that's really Riverhead to Montauk, so that's a relatively small area. And to get over 300 submissions from serious artists, I think that says something about that community. And it's about mentorship, where well-established artists actually do studio visits, because I think it's possible in an area like the East End. I think there is some kind of a notion of community, of locality.
Yeah, and I think a museum is many things. It's multidimensional. By the way, the San Francisco Fine Arts Museums recently did an open call in San Francisco, and it was a tremendous success. But I think that when you look at the totality of the museum, different parts of it relate to the community in different ways. So the education program is going to be completely community facing. It comes up also in the context of, how do you present things? So for example, M+ in Hong Kong, this is the largest art museum in modern art museum in Asia that's just finished actually, the construction, Herzog de Meuron building. But for example, they have these galleries, that these bamboo galleries that are going to look completely different than the galleries we're used to. And I don't want to skirt the issue. I think there is this tension that is hard to resolve. I think great museum directors find and curators find ways of resolving it. But I do think that a lot of it goes back to this issue of the pluralism of the museum, that it's okay to, it doesn't have to look like a flying saucer landed from some international art world. When my son was younger, when I went to Art Basel one year, my son was young. He said, "Where are you going? Are you going to the art world?" There is this kind of international art world,
and planet.
And it creates this sort of formula that I think has been fairly slavishly followed. And one of the models that have been sort of mindlessly adapted to everywhere is the white cube. And one of the statements that's made in the book is that the white cube is itself a period room. It is itself a product of a certain moment in a certain time when we made certain assumptions about artworks and their role. And, I think the time will come when fewer and fewer museum galleries will look like that. And
that's a good thing.
And I think that's a good thing. And it's, again, part of this idea of allowing the museum to be a bit more organically embedded in its context, which is one of the reasons why, I love the Parrish so much, because obviously it is so blended in with its own environment physically.
Right. And I think that was a real blessing that we discovered during the pandemic. It's, how can we use the outdoor space? How can we create that indoor-outdoor dialogue? And we could actually come back to the museum and activate the outdoor spaces before we could go into the galleries. And that was an incredible blessing. We have a whole new sculpture program, but we also did, we just pivoted immediately to bringing films and music projections to the outdoor spaces. And again, we went out, we talked to partners, and for example, we had planned to do a Black Film Festival in the winter, and we talked to a local organization, the Bridgehampton Child Care Center, and said, well, why don't we just put up a big screen and we do the festival in the summer? And so we pivoted very quickly. We made use of the space, and I think that kind of creativity and ingenuity is really important. And just discover yourself in a way, and look around and see what the possibilities are. And like you said, we have an amazingly beautiful building by Herzog de Meuron. We have an amazingly beautiful meadow, that we now can use and can interact with. And even in these winter months, we do outdoor tours, and people are coming. They put on their snow boots and they come, and it's just really where you also realize people need museums, and they want to be in museums.
Yeah, but they also are interested in the whole idea of the museum because, I think one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic era on museums will be that they finally rediscovered their own backyards. Actually, a very large proportion of the world's museums are in some kind of public space or another, which they largely ignore. I mean, they're used as kind of gathering spaces, but very often there's actual green space, but it's very rarely activated. I think that there was a rediscovery of these places, also a rediscovery of the possibilities of projection onto the museum building, of projecting the museum out beyond the museum. The Tel Aviv Museum, for example, did these wonderful projections all around the Bauhaus architecture in Tel Aviv, in Israel. So some of those things I think are really, positive outcomes, but it also comes hand in hand with, frankly, a conversation that has been also brewing for some time, which is we don't just have to think of the museum as something that's happening inside a box. A museum, actually, our friend Marc-Olivier Valère, who you just mentioned, who's in Geneva, he talks about the museum as an operating system.
Yeah.
It's really an idea. It's a set of ideas. It's a kind of software which can jump from one platform to the other. Now, the classic realization of the idea of the museum is a suite of galleries that are programmed by curators. But it is also an iPhone. It is also a restaurant. It can also be your fridge. It could be the road approaching the museum. It could be a satellite at the local airport. The idea of the museum can be freely realized in a multiplicity of forms and media. And I think that the next generation will be much more adept at sort of pushing the museum beyond the confines of the box.
Absolutely. And I think with, our digital addition to the physical space, we have a digital space, and we have a digital community with which you can also, have a whole other level of conversations. So I think on the one hand, we are, museums became ultra local, but also ultra global because, I think when the museum actually shut down, I kind of immediately realized, I realized where we are and that we have a community to serve, and that there are artists out there, that there are our audiences. They want to hear from us. They want to see us. And that's why we started the online programs. I started a project where I asked local artists to contribute short videos talking about their life during the pandemic. And that way you kind of could have a visit to their studios without going there. So we had over 50 artists contributing to that project. And you can see that on our website. But, ultimately, the digital world is also the digital is a tool to bring people to the physical space. And I think the physical space can never really be replaced.
Well, and you hear this time and again in the interviews. I think that there is look, if there's one thing I think we all realize is how much we miss the museum, just as we miss a restaurant and we miss a cinema, we miss a theater. And the two things we miss is the physicality of the experience and the social nature of the experience. It's the magic of the museum is this encounter with actual objects, but I think equally so that this encounter is happening in the company of others. Some people you know or love, or perfect strangers, which is transformative, and in architectural spaces which are themselves transfigurative in some way. And I think, if anything, we become hungrier for that. So yes, there's been this profusion of digital initiatives, and I think you have to understand this whole pandemic sort of came with good timing, because frankly, 10 years earlier, we couldn't have done this. The possibility of pushing out the museum on these digital channels was thanks to the frankly non-sexy, boring, hard to fund work of digitizing collections, putting together digital departments, having the infrastructure in place. And then, of course, we have things like Zoom that we're using right now. Can you imagine what the same experience would have been like, with fax machines? So in that respect, we got lucky. And museums were clever and quick in their movement. One of the things that I think they have to now ask is how much of that can be made permanent. And a lot of this stuff is actually behind the scenes. And I predict that this will be seen as a moment when the digital teams of museums finally have come of age. Unfortunately, inside museums, it's often still a very hierarchical world. And in that hierarchy, the sort of digital people are often sort of the young kids who are sort of in the basement, And but right now, I mean, several museum directors, in fact, say in this book, the first thing I did was to tell my young digital team, you're in charge now, because they literally were the only part of the museum that could still fulfill the mission of the museum. So I do think that maybe like one of the processes that hopefully this pandemic has catalyzed is a upscaling of the position of those in the organization who are capable of translating the museum program into these mediums. I personally believe that the chief digital officer of a museum should probably sit right next to the director, because the majority of a museum's audience now is coming online.
I think that's a very good point. And I mean, I think that was a huge learning curve for us at the parish, because we didn't have a digital, we still don't have a digital officer. And so everybody, had to immediately learn, how to do stories on Instagram and what makes sense. And we all became curators, and everybody became a communications person. So I think that was really interesting also, that it kind of like put all these structures upside down, who does what. I think that was a big scramble at the beginning. And we all learned very quickly. And we learned that, that the digital presence is incredibly important.
But
So
not just as a broadcast opportunity. I think some of the most interesting parts of this is how museums use this as a way to create a two-way relationship. So if you look at what MASPI did with Adriano Pedrosa in Sao Paulo, where they had these Instagram campaigns where they asked people to propose images of the baby Jesus. I'm not exactly sure, but
he asked them to draw works from the
draw.
collection, and to send in those images.
So what was really interesting is that the museums, the clever museums, were not just using these digital pipelines to sort of push content, but to create this dialogue with the audience, which I was a very, very smart thing to do for those who did it.
Absolutely. Andras, I would like to pivot to one very broad question or theme, and I think the funding structures of museums. I thought that was also interesting in your book, and it's interesting also because both you and I come from Europe, although from the opposite end of the Iron Curtain. You grew up in Hungary, I grew up in Switzerland, but all over Europe, there was always this expectation and understanding that museums were funded by the government, and in America it's pretty much the opposite. It's all privately funded, so both models I think are problematic. And I thought some of what I think Eugene Tan from Singapore had some very interesting things to say about crowdsourcing, sort of alternative ideas for fundraising for museums. If you do crowdsourcing, then you have a community who believes in you. It's kind of like NPR, it's all audience funded. Or another model that I actually, speaking of Brazil, that I thought is really interesting. I did a project a few years ago with Idea City from New Museum at SESC Pompeia in Sao Paulo. And SESC is a Brazilian organization that was founded in the 50s, and it's based on a voluntary tax from the business community. They provide 1.5% of their income towards this cultural organization. And they have centers all over Brazil. They have like, I think, over 300 centers. And these centers they are museums, they are, everything's together: museum, sports, healthcare, libraries, you name it. And I found that an incredible model, actually. So can you speak a little bit to what your findings were about, funding issues?
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't think that it's as simple as saying that one system is good and the other is bad. That state system is good or state system is bad. I mean, I'm reminded of George Bernard Shaw, who said the best system of government is a benevolent dictatorship by a really smart and benevolent dictator. I mean, I grew up in a part of the world where state ownership was not seen as a blessing. It was seen as a source of censorship and constraint. If you look at a country like Germany, which steered billions of dollars to the cultural sphere in the middle of the pandemic, it was probably one of the best places to be in 2020 if you're working in the cultural sector. So you can't reduce any one system. And similarly, private funding, we were having, by the way, before we got into the pandemic, we were having a kind of conniption in the field about a tremendous anxiety about private funding. The last great scandal or crisis in the museum field arguably was around museum trustees, particularly here in New York. But even so, some of the most healthy and happy museums in the world actually are private museums funded by private benefactors who are incredibly smart and are able to provide resources and are often actually really well organized because they come from the business world. So you can't.
That's the benevolent dictator.
Yeah, the benevolent dictators. So I think I'm glad you point to a southern hemispheric example a moment ago, because I think that the Asian story, the Asian chapter in the evolution of the museum will bring changes. The museum started in Europe, and so we ended up with these Greek temples, and then it went to America, and we ended up with these, America left its imprint on the museum. Now we're arguably in a half century or more where there's this profusion of Asian museums, and there's a strengthening of Asia. And I think one of the differences between Asia and Europe, and particularly Asia and Europe, is that there are far fewer lingering sentimental, romantic attitudes about how culture can operate. So there's perhaps a greater openness to different operating models. There isn't sort of an immediate sense of like, oh my goodness, we can't do that because it's a museum. I mean, in Germany, for example, it's still very hard to even donate to a museum because immediately people are concerned that, private interests are corroding the purity of culture. In the United States, I think a lot of people
Opposite.
Is opposite, but at the same time, there's a lot of suspicion and anxiety around, let's say, corporate sponsors and what are they trying to do.
That's more recent, though. Yeah.
More recent. In Asia, there's a much more open mindset. And we'll see what kind of models evolve, including digitally enabled models. And but one interesting example, certainly in beyond Singapore, was the UCCA in Beijing, which is started out life as a private foundation and is now under the incredible Phil Tinari mushrooming into sort of like the Guggenheim of China, with multiple locations, with a kind of very strong business mindset behind it, including a special unit that the museum operates to propose and manage alliances and projects with major brands, and for good money, which then goes back to support the cultural mission. And and there's a reason why a unit like that was born in Beijing before it was born in New York. New York is a pretty commercially minded city, but I don't think we have a museum that has this kind of a unit. So,
Well, because museums here, they're still nonprofit organizations, and that's kind of the conundrum or the contradiction, I think, is that although we're nonprofit organizations, it depends on private sponsorship. So, I
exactly.
think that Asian model is very interesting to.
Yes, and then now people would say, those who are listening might say, but look at the censorship and look at the government control and look at how some of these new museums are money laundering operations. I mean, I always look at the story with Asia as a kind of echo of what happened a century ago when Europeans would come to New York and they would come to the Met with its sort of plaster casts of European sculptures, and they would just snub their noses and say, well, these Americans, it's not the real thing. Well, a century later, things look very differently. Right now, there's a certain amount of disdain, often in international perspectives on emerging museum systems in places like China or places like the UAE. A lot of the criticism is perhaps justified, but you also have to understand that these are very new systems, and it is where the energy is. And in my view, a museum is a very long-term proposition. The interesting thing is, what will these institutions look like 20 years from now, 50 years from now, or give them another 100 years, and then let's see, who's operating successful museums. So in general, I'm very blessed in my life. I worked on the commercial side of the art world. I worked with some very big brands, even though right now we're talking about museums. And I've always believed that what gives energy and vitality to the visual art world, for example, if you compare it to other so-called high culture worlds, is the hybridity, is that there's this coexistence of commercial energies, nonprofit energies, and both sides really have a lot to learn from each other. And this comes through in the book, by the way. When you ask these museum directors, where do they look for models for what kind of museums to build, they almost never point to other museums as their examples and touchstones. They are more likely to point to media companies and startups and dynamic commercial entities like Netflix as sort of where the clues may be to how to position an organization in today's information economy.
Right. Andras, this is really super interesting conversation. I would like to address some of the questions that we have received from our audience. Someone is asking, are boards of directors prepared to support reinvention and heightened awareness that minorities and women must be included in staffing and artist selection?
Well, that depends on which board of directors. I think that, I think this is a major topic now in every boardroom in America. And I think you see some institutions which are moving very rapidly in that direction. As I mentioned, I'm looking out at the Brooklyn Museum, which I think is setting a very good example. But this is a very slow transformation. And one of the things I do like to point out, I said it somewhere this week in a publication, is that these things do not happen overnight. One of the museums in this book actually calculated how many years it would take for them to achieve gender parity in their collections. How many years would they have to only buy works by women to finally be able to say they have parity? It would take them 85 years of not buying a single work by a man. And that illustrates the complexity of the challenges. Similarly, if you have a 60-member board or a 40-member board, unless you're going to be kind of brutal and start kicking people off, it's going to take time to find and recruit people for that board, and also for others to roll off. Similarly with staffing, every museum in America is looking now to diversify, rightly so, its curatorial ranks. Um, but we're talking about an educational system that doesn't necessarily hasn't provided a pipeline, although a lot of it is choice. Sandra Dumont Jackson in Los Angeles showed us and talks about in the book how oftentimes it's really just a question of making that decision and acting on it. So what I would say is huge variation, and everywhere it's going to take a number of years to really have these processes run their course.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And I mean, the same is happening at the Parrish. We received a very generous grant from Aggie Gund and Dorothy Lichtenstein to start this Arts Reach initiative on art and social justice a couple of years ago. And, we did retreats with the board, with the staff, with community members about DEAI, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. And while we're working towards it, it is a long process, and it takes a lot of effort. But I think, yeah, we have to make the effort. Every museum has to make the effort, and I think for the most part, boards are behind that. I don't see any resistance to that, and I see a lot of support in that direction.
I personally believe that the most lasting legacy of 2020 in terms of significant behavior modification will be in this area. I mean, visitors will return, finances will stabilize, but these changes are really the most consequential and lasting changes that you'll be able to trace back to this year. I mean, they were long overdue.
Right. Another question is, should the larger museums' vast holdings be more frequently loaned to smaller community-based cultural organizations and small museums? Why has this not been done?
Well, that's a great question. Whoever asked that, thank you. It points to, I think, how should I say charitably, not yet fully exploited opportunities for collaboration among museums. Unfortunately, in our nonprofit sector in general, there is not as much collaboration as we would like. There have, in fact, been efforts made, but going back to the 80s, there was something called the Museum Loan Network, which was predicated on this very idea that there are things sitting in one museum that may be helpful to another. I would say that there are some misunderstandings around this. When people say, oh, 80% of a museum's collection is sitting in storage. I mean, most museums do keep the things that are truly great on display if they can. Nonetheless, I think that there are many opportunities here. A lot of this has to do with incentives or lack of incentives. It would be a great thing for a foundation, for example, to facilitate and promote and incentivize. And there are also very interesting, and I'm not going to get lost in the weeds, technological and technical questions around just the sheer complexity of all these things running around. Lastly, one of the things that is happening is not loaning, but co-ownership. I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and you're beginning to see it at a high level. But especially as sort of bookkeeping and accounting and other technologies evolve, it may become easier to facilitate co-ownership of works going forward. It's really part of a much larger story about the lag that the museum sector has in sort of managing its assets. I think we're going to see quite a lot of change in this field in the future.
I definitely agree. I think the pandemic forced a lot of museums to scale back, on traveling exhibitions. But on loans, but I think that, but I think the sharing of resources, which I think can include collection, I think that is something that will definitely be more discussed amongst museums.
Collections, staff, communications, marketing, technology, back office, on and on and on.
Resources.
You know,
Yeah.
we our in our sector, nobody goes out of business and nobody merges. Um, I'm not saying that that's what I want, but you know, there's been all these very ominous forecasts of thousands of museums going under. But before you go under, you should explore other possibilities of combining forces. There's a great, I mean, this is an ongoing discussion in the nonprofit sector about the fragmentation of resources, the fragmentation of funding, the inefficiencies. And whenever these things are mentioned, people start worrying about, you know, some sort of neoliberal corporate logic takeover. Um, all the same, um, there's clearly a lot that can be done, particularly on a regional basis, where you often have a number of struggling, impoverished groups sitting side by side. Earlier this week, I had a conversation about libraries. You know, you may have 4 museums, you know, within a mile of each other, each one operating a library, each one struggling to support its library. There's got to be some more clever ways of looking at where resources could be shared.
I would like to ask you the last question from the audience, and then I have one question to conclude this.
Sure.
What about security and funds available to ensure collections are safe? Highest number of break and entry and losses have been happening during the pandemic.
Well, I think the good news is that one of the blessings of technology is that it's incredible what kind of security technology now exists for museums. It's one of those areas that you don't hear a lot about for understandable reasons. It's, by the way, very complicated because you quickly run into very, very sticky topics about facial recognition and privacy and so on. But suffice it to say that the world is not standing still, and there's a lot of technological progress around this issue. I'll leave it at that. This is like a very particular area, but certainly something that institutions think about. Also, because with you don't want to build a fortress around the museum. You try not to have a museum with a metal detector and all those things. So it's actually a very, very interesting subject, and it's much discussed. But I think it's ultimately something that leads in the direction of to what extent will museums want to avail themselves of technologies which in some cases they may not be ideologically or temperamentally predisposed to adopt.
Thank you, Andras. And thank you so much for this conversation and for writing the book. I mean, I feel like we just touched on the tip of the iceberg, but I really recommend the book for any museum professional because there are so many different opinions and experiences in the book that I think are relevant to all of us. I would like to ask you one last question, and that is, what would you like to see at the Parrish that you don't see right now? Or what advice do you have to our new director, who is, by the way, Kelly Texter? So I hope she's listening.
Well, me too. And let me also welcome her and join many people who are looking forward to this next great chapter. And let me acknowledge that the previous chapter of this museum, despite so many odds, it's been a resounding success. I think the fact that you have this extraordinary building sitting there in the middle of Long Island is a great accomplishment. And
thank you. And I would like to mention our recent director, Terry Sultan,
right.
Who oversaw the construction of the building.
Thing.
Yeah.
So, but now that that infrastructure is in place, what a great challenge to sort of rethink the software that you run on it. And boy, I mean, where do I start? I think that many of those things we talked about today, the pivot to the local community, obviously the unique opportunities you have now in Long Island in terms of like the whole world is there, parts of the world that didn't used to be there. The very interesting dialogue with nature, botany, environmental sustainability, farming, topics that a generation ago you would never have thought about in the context of museums, but which are vibrant areas of opportunity, obviously connected to gastronomy as well. The idea of outdoor activation we already talked about, and there's been some important steps made. I look forward to spending many beautiful nights in screenings and driving by the museum and seeing the whole place activated and so on. But the one thing, and of course the embrace of local groups like Auto Body, please, more of that. But I think the one thing that one of the things that I really could imagine, and I'm saying purely out of self-interest as someone who lives sort of not far, it makes me think of a place like Aspen, you know, and the Ideas Festival, and how great minds and great people come to Aspen each year to think about the world and to exchange ideas. I think that Long Island, it would be uniquely well positioned for that going forward, and I hope that and that's of course an area that Corinne you would resonate with. But I think that when you listen to all these directors talk about the possibilities of the museum, what they keep coming back to is this idea of the museum as a platform, as a public square, as a place where different ideas and viewpoints can be exchanged and developed. So I could imagine the Parrish as being part of a network of institutions in the region, on Long Island, beyond Long Island, but ultimately as a place where people could gather at different times of the year for this kind of extraordinary festival of ideas. I know that I would be first in line.
It's totally noted, Andras. I'd be really up for that. And I think, you know, the beauty of the space, the beauty of the place, that's why a lot of people come out to the Hamptons. And I think a place like that is tremendously inspiring. So I do hope we can be a center for ideas, and I'll definitely call you up to advise us on that. I want to thank you, Andras, for this really inspiring conversation.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to wish you and all of your colleagues and your board and your new director the best of, it's not luck you need, it's grit. And I've no doubt that, as they say, the best is yet to come. So thank you again.
Thank you, Andras. Thanks everyone for watching. Good night.
Bye-bye.